Okay, so we're starting a new section looking at the role of the media and public opinion and how that can sort of interact to shape or constrain foreign policy. And I'll just sort of begin by kind of talking about how public opinion matters in foreign policy. I think typically it's described in one of two ways. It's either a limiting factor or it's a driving factor. So if we're thinking about it as a limiting factor, we can maybe take the idea that by and large, the population doesn't pay a lot of attention to foreign policy. Its views are kind of amorphous. As a result, leaders generally have wide latitude to implement foreign policy how they like. But after a while, the public's view, public opinion may solidify into either opposition for a policy or support of a policy, at which point it becomes difficult for leaders to go against that public opinion. That once public opinion has sort of solidified and gelled, leaders find it very hard to sustain unpopular positions and find it very difficult to change from popular positions. So that's one argument, that it's this constraining factor that sort of emerges when the public finally does come to an agreement or a consensus. Another argument about public opinion is that the public puts forward demands of things that it wants from leaders, but doesn't necessarily have a preference for how those things are carried out. So wanting pandemics to be managed effectively and the global pandemic to go away, that might be a thing that the public is asking for, or asking for greater export opportunities or change to trade policy, or dealing with travel possibilities, a variety of different things that the public says, I want this, and then it's up to leaders to say, okay, so how do I do that? I can't really do that without international cooperation. And so I'm going to be pushed into, a foreign policy and into an engagement with the rest of the world, because in a globalized world, there's really no way to do the things that the public is asking without some level of engagement with the international community. And so this is something that Mark Boyer describes as defensive internationalism, that leaders aren't necessarily choosing to engage in a globalized world and build a more interdependent, interconnected international system. They're doing it as a reaction to these things that their populations are asking for them to take on and solve, and can only be solved through international cooperation. So there's an argument to be made that public opinion does play a role in foreign policy, whether it's a constraint or whether it's a driver. But realists have historically been pretty skeptical about this, and realist theorists have even blatantly argued that the public should not have a role in crafting foreign policy, and that the public is detrimental to states doing the kind of things that they need to do to be effective in the foreign policy realm. And the realist perspective on and skepticism for this really comes down to the general public doesn't have a lot of information, doesn't pay a lot of attention to foreign policy, and therefore is going to make uninformed and presumably incorrect policy decisions. And so if I was going to take the realist perspective on this, I might throw up this map and say, well, so this is one of those maps where you sort of touch a point in the screen and it records where you touch. And a bunch of people were asked to find North Korea, and some of them did. It's kind of to the west of Japan there. Of course, some of them missed and hit South Korea, but a heck of a lot more missed by hundreds, if not thousands of miles, including sort of misnaming pretty prominent countries in the international system like China and India and Australia and Iran. And so if I'm a realist looking at this, saying the public's not paying attention to even the most general of patterns about what's happening in the world, they shouldn't have sort of a say in how a state navigates that. Another thing that realists will oftentimes point to is this question that's fairly famous about what percentage of the US government spending goes to foreign aid. And if you ask the population, and this was asked every couple of years by the Council on Foreign Relations for a number of years, and in 2002, they polled 1,000 people, and the response came back with an average of 31%. So that's the average. Some folks thought it was significantly higher, some folks thought it was significantly lower, but the actual percentage was around 1% in 2002. So the public, on a number of measures, just sort of has orders of magnitude of misinformation that's really problematic, realists would argue. However, I think that historical skepticism has started to maybe softened a little bit in recent years. And so one source of that softening has come from foreign policy theorists who've noted that the information that people have about what's happening in the world comes through a complex process, right? We're gaining information from our neighbors and our friends and our family. We're gaining information through media networks. We're gaining information because we're taking cues from politicians. And all of this kind of interacts in a certain sort of way that results in people developing opinions that aren't necessarily based on a deep reading of the situation, but are based on taking cues from other sources that they've chosen to. And so we exist in sort of information networks that is where our opinions come from, not necessarily from a detailed understanding of the facts. There's also been sort of an interesting series of studies by Kretzer and also by McGraw here, arguing that there's this sort of folk realism that exists within the population. And what they've noticed is that people tend to be more hawkish, more aggressive and war prone and thinking about the international system in terms of power politics when they have less information. And so people sort of default into a realist mindset when they just don't know what's going on, and that's sort of their safe zone. But as they gain greater information or they have more sophisticated experiences with a topic, they tend to develop more nuanced policy views with that information. A third thing that I maybe point to is that while the public and individuals may not have a deep, rich, informed understanding of foreign policy and of what's happening in the world, it doesn't mean that those opinions that people are picking up through these networks of information are irrational or insane or random. And so I think I've got sort of two examples that the Pew Trends in Political Values study has noted, and they ask a series of questions about foreign policy every year. And so there's one of these questions is, we, in this case, Americans, should get even with any country that tries to take advantage of the United States. And so it's kind of bumping along at sort of this 40% more or less agrees. And then you get sort of this spike up around 90, 91, 92, where about 10 to 15% of the population becomes more sympathetic to that perspective. And then it kind of drops back down. And then after September 11th, it spikes again up to 61%. And so if I was trying to tell a story of that, I would say you've got sort of this baseline level of about 40% that's maybe taking this realist sort of perspective on things. It's maybe a default. But then when events come along, like the collapse of the Soviet Union, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the successful ouster of Iraq from Kuwait, and then following that sort of the debacle in Somalia with the intervention there, public opinion moves in response to that. After September 11th, public opinion moves in a more aggressive way. But following the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and that turning into a protracted insurgency, public opinion sort of reverts back to where it was. Likewise, we could tell the same story about the best way to secure, to provide security is through military strength. After the invasion of Iraq by invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein in 1991, the American public suddenly thinks military force is a really successful tool. Then it reverts back to sort of where it was. There's a bump up shortly after the US successful invasion of Afghanistan, but then it drops after Iraq turns into a protracted civil war. So it's not as though public opinion is irrational or completely out of sync. It's that public opinion is responding oftentimes to events that are occurring, responding to a complex information environment, and maybe has sort of a baseline default level of folk realism that sort of sets a ground level for where people start, and then they sort of augment based off of that.